Lights dimmed as a hush rolled across the auditorium, the kind of silence that doesn't happen by request but by instinct. Hundreds of young leaders, students, organizers, first-time voters, leaned forward as Jasmine Crockett stepped into the glow of the stage. The moment she appeared, conversations cut off mid-sentence, camera phones rose like a synchronized wave, and an electric tension gathered in the air. People had come expecting a polished keynote, a safe message, maybe even a few rehearsed lines about leadership and civic duty. Instead, something in her presence, steady, grounded, unguarded, signaled that the script they imagined was already dissolving. You could see it in the way the front row straightened, in the way the back row stopped scrolling, in the way a single gasp fluttered from somewhere near the center. Crockett paused at the podium, not for effect, but to breathe in the room itself, as if she felt the weight of every eye waiting to be moved, challenged, or proven wrong. The air tightened, anticipation thick enough to taste. No one understood why their hearts were beating faster, but everyone felt it coming. But almost no one in that room had any idea what she was about to reveal next. The event had begun as a quiet, almost improbable idea. Mitt Romney, the seasoned statesman with decades of public life behind him, inviting a rising Democratic voice to speak to a hall full of young leaders hungry for relevance. His intention was simple on paper: bring voices that could challenge, inspire, and push the next generation beyond predictable scripts. But the moment the announcement hit the airwaves, the noise began. Commentators scoffed that it was a publicity stunt. Online trolls dismissed it as political theater. Traditionalists muttered that Crockett wasn't the right kind of messenger for such an audience. The chorus of critics swelled so loudly that for days the event itself became a litmus test for who believed in possibility and who clung to their cynicism like a shield. Yet beneath the surface, the stakes were larger than any headline acknowledged. America was trapped in a moment where every disagreement felt like a battlefield, where authenticity had become rare enough to feel radical. Young leaders were starving for someone, anyone who could speak without fear, without calculation, without rehearsed polish designed to offend no one and inspire even fewer. And the symbolism of the moment was undeniable: a Republican elder choosing to amplify a Democratic firebrand who refused to shrink herself to fit the expectations of power. To some, it felt like an experiment. To others, a provocation. But to the young faces gathering in that room, it felt like a chance to hear a truth unfiltered by the usual political machinery. They sensed, even before she spoke, that this was not going to be the kind of speech they would forget. But before Crockett even opened her mouth, tensions were already brewing in the hall. Long before Jasmine Crockett reached that stage, a different kind of storm had been gathering, one brewed not in meeting rooms or planning committees, but in the echo chambers of pundits, comment threads, and late-night political chatter. The moment her name appeared on the lineup, a familiar wave of doubt rolled across the airwaves. Some commentators smirked through their segments, predicting the event would devolve into spectacle. They spoke with the casual arrogance of people who believed they'd seen it all, insisting young audiences only wanted drama, not depth, and certainly not from a woman who refused to dilute her voice to fit neatly into anyone's expectations. Online, the reaction was even harsher. Threads erupted with snide predictions that the night would spiral into chaos, that Crockett would be too much, that the crowd would tune out within minutes. The cynics typed with smug certainty, convinced the country had grown too hardened, too jaded, too divided to embrace a message rooted in sincerity. They mocked the idea of unity before the event had even begun, pushing out narratives that painted the speech as doomed, unnecessary, or hopelessly naive. Memes circulated before a single word was spoken. Headlines questioned the purpose of pairing generational leadership with voices unafraid to disrupt the status quo. The loudest skeptics treated the invitation like an unforced error, shaking their heads and declaring that audiences didn't want truth anymore. They wanted noise. They wanted conflict for entertainment's sake, not clarity that might challenge them to imagine something better. But inside the hall, the atmosphere rejected every one of those predictions. The young crowd wasn't restless or detached. They were alive with expectation. They leaned forward instead of leaning back. They whispered to each other, not with cynicism, but with hope. Hope that someone might finally speak to them without condescension or prepackaged talking points. Where critics saw inevitable failure, these young leaders saw potential. It was the oldest divide in American storytelling, those who cling to their doubts like armor and those who look for the spark that could carry them forward. And on this night, that divide was about to become unmistakable. But if the critics were confident Crockett would stumble, they were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin under bright lights or before cheering crowds. It began in Texas, where the air was thick with heat and expectation, and where she learned early that identity wasn't something you hid to fit in, but something you carried like a birthright. She grew up watching people work hard because they had no other choice, watching neighbors stand up for one another because community meant survival. Those roots shaped her, grounding her in a world that demanded both toughness and tenderness, a world where you spoke plainly because truth had no time for decoration. As she got older, activism wasn't an abstract concept to her. It was the natural extension of everything she'd been taught. She saw the gaps, the unfairness, the broken systems that left too many behind. So she stepped into public defense work, walking into courtrooms with clients who had nothing but their stories, their fear, and the hope that someone, anyone, would stand beside them. She fought for people most had already dismissed, learning firsthand how justice bent under pressure and how often it needed someone unafraid to push back. That work sharpened her mind and her instincts. It taught her to see through posturing, to cut through noise, and to stand firm even when tempers rose like flames around her. Her wit became a shield, her clarity a kind of quiet weapon. When she entered public service, she carried all of that with her: the long hours, the heartbreaks, the small victories, the unspoken promise that she would never shrink from a fight worth having. Younger generations saw themselves in her because she didn't pretend to be polished. She didn't soften her edges to make others comfortable. She spoke in the voice she grew up with, a voice that told people the truth even when it was inconvenient, a voice that carried the rhythm of lived experience rather than rehearsed lines. Time and again, she found herself in heated exchanges where others expected her to fold. Instead, she held steady, meeting condescension with composure, pressure with precision, and dismissiveness with the kind of strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Those moments stitched themselves into her story, each one becoming a layer of the storm she carried inside her. And now, as she approached the podium in front of a room full of young leaders, every challenge she'd survived, every truth she'd spoken, every battle she'd fought was rising behind her like a gathering force. And with every step she took toward that podium, those experiences were gathering like a storm behind her. From the moment Jasmine Crockett placed her hands on the sides of the podium, the room shifted again. What had started as a collective hush grew into a low ripple of murmurs, the kind that skims beneath the surface when people are unsure of what comes next. A few young leaders in the back crossed their arms, not out of hostility, but out of habit. Skepticism etched into their posture. They had seen speeches that promised transformation but delivered little more than decorative language, and they were bracing themselves for more of the same. Others leaned forward with an entirely different energy, the ones who had followed her past exchanges and remembered every sharp retort, every moment she refused to be diminished. They expected fire. They expected sparks. They expected the kind of verbal electricity she had become known for. The pressure in the room built quietly, like a tightening rope. Some people hoped she would deliver a message filled with uplift, something that could illuminate the path ahead for a generation that felt caught between crisis and possibility. Others waited for theatrics, assuming her reputation meant she would stride into conflict, even when no one had thrown the first punch. The tension sat between these expectations, hovering like a question waiting to be answered. But Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture or stride or pierce the air with a cutting line. Instead, her tone softened into something grounded, warm, and unexpectedly intimate. She spoke with steady control, each word chosen with care, as though she were pulling the room closer rather than pushing it to react. Her clarity sliced through the tension without attacking it, her presence somehow calming the very audience that arrived divided in their predictions. She looked out at them not as skeptics or fans, but as inheritors of a country still fighting to define itself. And as the crowd adjusted to the quiet power of her beginning, anticipation curled through the room once more, sharper now, almost electric. But it was what she said next that made the entire room forget to breathe. Section 6. The mic drop moment. When Jasmine Crockett finally lifted her gaze from the podium, the room felt suspended in a kind of quiet anticipation, as if every heartbeat had synchronized to the same slow rhythm. And then she began, not with statistics, not with lofty rhetoric, but with a story so personal the room seemed to fold inward around her words. She spoke of her grandmother, a woman who worked double shifts in a small Texas town, who carried herself with a dignity that didn't come from wealth or recognition, but from the way she treated people when no one was watching. Jasmine described nights sitting beside her, listening to stories of struggle softened by perseverance, tales of near losses countered by the stubborn decision to keep going anyway. The crowd stilled. Some leaned closer, pulled in by the simplicity and intimacy of the memory, the kind of story that didn't need embellishment to feel profound. Then her tone shifted, just slightly, enough to signal that she was guiding them somewhere deeper. She spoke of the ways people drift apart, how division creeps in like a slow fog, blurring the familiar until neighbors forget how to see each other with generosity. She didn't blame anyone. She didn't accuse. She simply held up a mirror to the fractures people pretended not to notice, the ones that made them feel small, isolated, or unseen. Her clarity was gentle but unflinching, and it washed over the room with the disarming power of someone speaking a truth everyone recognizes but rarely says out loud. A few people nodded, slowly at first, then with growing conviction. Others held their breath, sensing the sudden openness, the way her words cut through the noise without raising their volume. And then came the part that softened even the skeptics. Jasmine admitted she didn't always feel fearless. She spoke of nights lying awake, wondering whether her voice mattered, whether she could carry the responsibility that seemed to grow heavier with every passing year. She admitted to fear, not as weakness, but as evidence of how much she cared, and she paired that fear with hope. Hope that vulnerability could be strength, hope that honesty could still reach people across lines they'd been taught to guard. As she spoke, her voice gained a quiet music, almost poetic in its cadence. She talked about dignity, not the kind bestowed by titles or applause, but the kind built through choices made in silence. She talked about courage, the everyday kind, the version that doesn't roar but whispers, "Try again." And she spoke directly to the young faces in front of her, calling them inheritors of a future that would demand not perfection, but intention, compassion, and the willingness to stand tall even when the world tried to shrink them. The room had become so silent that even the softest rustle sounded amplified. People blinked back unexpected emotion, surprised by how much of themselves they saw reflected in her words. A single tear slipped down the cheek of someone in the second row. A few others exhaled shakily, as if they'd been holding tension they didn't realize they carried. And then came the moment, the line that changed the temperature of the room. She paused, letting the silence gather around her, and said, "Courage isn't born when the world finally recognizes you. Courage is born the moment you recognize yourself." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. A ripple moved through the crowd, sharp and undeniable, as if everyone felt something shift inside them at the same time. People sat back, absorbing it, stunned by the simplicity and truth of it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the hush deepened even further, a reverent stillness that belonged not to speeches, but to moments that linger long after they end. She didn't chase the applause that was building beneath the silence. She simply continued with a grace that made the entire hall feel humbled. She closed her message with a call to the generation before her, to be gentle with themselves, to be brave enough to imagine a life defined not by fear, but by purpose, to treat their own stories as worthy of pride and protection. Her words wrapped around the room like a warm wind, lifting faces that had arrived carrying doubts they no longer felt alone in. When she finally stepped back from the mic, there was a heartbeat of absolute stillness, and then the eruption came. Thunderous applause filled the hall, rising so quickly it felt like the room itself exhaled. People stood, some wiping their eyes, others still frozen in stunned admiration. By the time she stepped back from the mic, half the crowd was on its feet, and no one could pretend the future hadn't just shifted. The applause was still echoing through the hall when the first phones shot into the air, recording fragments of Jasmine's final lines as though people instinctively understood they were capturing something that wouldn't stay contained within four walls. By the time the crowd began to settle, clips had already hit social media, spreading with the kind of velocity usually reserved for breaking news or unexpected miracles. Within minutes, timelines filled with snippets of her voice, soft, steady, resolute, accompanied by captions like, "I didn't expect to cry today," and "This is the energy our generation needed." Hashtags bloomed almost instantly, overlapping until they formed a chorus of admiration and disbelief. Users stitched together their favorite moments, the line about courage, the quiet confession of fear, the story about her grandmother delivered with such tenderness it felt like a blessing. Comment threads overflowed with people sharing their own stories, their own doubts, their own attempts at recognizing themselves again. What began as a speech transformed into a collective emotional release, a digital ripple swelling into a wave. Commentators scrambled to catch up. Some admitted they had underestimated her. Others simply replayed the clips on loop, their voices softened with genuine surprise. Thought leaders chimed in, praising the rare combination of vulnerability and certainty she brought to the stage. They spoke of how her delivery cut through the performative polish people had grown used to, how refreshing it was to witness sincerity hold an entire room in stillness. Meanwhile, young attendees poured out of the venue with wide eyes and animated voices, describing how something had shifted internally. They talked about feeling seen in a way that transcended politics or roles. They talked about calling family members, journaling what they felt, or reconsidering the stories they'd spent years hiding. For many, it wasn't just a speech. It was a recalibration. Off to the side, Romney watched it all unfold with a calm, reflective pride. He hadn't needed applause or praise. The transformation in the room was enough. He could see it in the softened faces, the renewed posture of the young leaders filing out, the spark he had hoped to ignite now burning far brighter than expected. The risk he had taken felt not just justified, but necessary. But the real impact wouldn't reveal itself until the days that followed. In the days that followed, as the noise of the world surged back into its usual rhythm, Something about Jasmine Crockett's message continued to echo long after the applause faded. People replayed her words not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were startlingly real. At a time when so much of public life felt like posturing, her sincerity cut through the static like clarity after a storm. It reminded people the truth carries a resonance that doesn't need amplification. It simply needs to be spoken with conviction. What struck people most wasn't the content of her story alone, but the way she offered it. She didn't try to impress or overwhelm. She didn't hide behind polished lines. She showed the crowd that authenticity, raw, unguarded, human, still has the power to draw people together in ways they had almost forgotten were possible. It wasn't just her courage they remembered, but the reflection of their own courage she summoned forth, the quiet reminder that dignity begins with recognizing one's own worth. Those who had been in the room spoke of a rare unity, the kind that rises when people stop performing and start listening. They talked about how the atmosphere had shifted from skepticism to shared purpose, how faces that arrived guarded gradually softened into openness. In a moment defined by division, the simplest truths were the ones that carried the most weight. Honesty creates connection, vulnerability invites understanding, and integrity can still kindle hope even when the world feels heavy. And beneath it all lay the deeper lesson she had woven into every line, one that reached beyond generations, identities, or backgrounds. The values she invoked belonged to no single group. They were the inheritance of anyone willing to claim them. Courage to stand firm, truth spoken without fear, responsibility to one another, service rooted in compassion. These were the threads she offered, trusting that the audience would know how to weave them into their own lives. And as her word continued to ripple outward, it became clear what the moment had truly been about. In the end, the speech wasn't about politics at all. It was about building a country brave enough to hear one another again. Section 9. Outro and Call to Action. What happened in that hall didn't stay in that hall, and that's why the story carries the weight it does. The moment Mitt Romney invited Jasmine Crockett to speak became more than a headline. It became a reminder of what can unfold when authenticity meets opportunity, when a single voice speaks with enough clarity to move an entire room to tears. And now that you've witnessed that journey, from the hush of anticipation to the eruption of hope, you're part of the ripple it created. If this message moved you, let it keep moving. If you believe this country is still capable of hearing one another, share this story with someone who might need a spark of courage today. And if you want more moments where truth rises above the noise, stay connected, stay curious, and stay open to the voices that dare to speak from the heart. Because hope spreads when we choose to carry it forward.